Hey everyone, my name is Naguura, and today I got a Moonkin guide for the War Within Season 1 for you. First of all, I want to mention that I got almost all of the information for this guide from the Moonkin Compendium, the Balanced Druid Compendium, and I will link it below. So if you prefer a written guide, or if you want to double check if the information in this guide is still correct, go check out the link below. Also keep in mind, Moonkin will be getting some major changes for 11.0.5, the 20-year anniversary patch, so I will upload a new updated guide then. Now let's get into it. First of all, I do want to go over some very basics for Moonkin, so if you are more advanced, make sure you skip this part. So, Moonkin's resource is Astral Power, and our main generators of Astral Power are Wrath, a single target nature damage spell, and Starfire, an arcane damage spell dealing splash damage to surrounding targets. We also call those two spells fillers. Outside of the fillers, we also generate Astral Power with our dots, other passive abilities, and certain talents like moons, for example, but I will explain this in more detail later. We can spend this Astral Power on either Star Surge or Starfall. Star Surge is a single target damage nuke, and Starfall is our AoE spender, doing damage to any target in combat with you or your group within a 45 yards radius of your character for 8 seconds. It's important to understand the type of damage Moonkin's basic spells do, and how the Eclipse system works. If you cast 2 Starfires, you enter Solar Eclipse. This is a 15 seconds buff, increasing your nature damage done. If you cast 2 Wraths, you enter Lunar Eclipse, and this is also a 15 seconds buff, increasing your arcane damage done. You can only be in one Eclipse at a time, unless you have your cooldowns up, Celestial Alignment or Incarnation or Orbital Strike. We have 2 main dots, Sunfire and Moonfire. The dots increase your nature and arcane damage dealt to the target respectively, depending on how much mastery you have. Now, what does all of this mean? So since your Wrath is a single target damage spell and does nature damage, you want to enter Solar Eclipse on single target by casting 2 Starfires and then proceed to cast Wrath as a filler while in Solar Eclipse. Unless you run a certain hero talent, but I will explain this later. You want to spend your Astral Power on Star Surge on single target, and you want to prefer casting Star Surge inside Eclipse to make sure you gain the extra damage increase from Solar Eclipse. Star Surge does astral damage, so it benefits from both Solar and Lunar Eclipse equally, because astral damage is the combination of arcane and nature damage. On any scenario with more than one target, you prefer entering Lunar Eclipse by casting 2 Wraths and then proceed to cast Starfire as your filler in Lunar Eclipse because it does arcane damage, which is increased in Lunar Eclipse, and additionally Starfire does splash damage to surrounding targets. On AoE, you want to spend your Astral Power on Starfall. Starfall also does astral damage, just like Star Surge, so it also benefits from both Solar and Lunar Eclipse equally. So for a very basic single target rotation, you want to make sure both Moonfire and Sunfire are always up, and you can refresh them within Pandemic range. Pandemic means the duration of the dot is 30% or less on your target. In that case, the remaining duration gets added to the newly applied dot. Then you enter Solar Eclipse by casting 2 Starfires, and you spend your Astral Power on Star Surges while you are inside Eclipse. For a basic AoE rotation, you apply Sunfire and Moonfire to all targets, then cast 2 Wraths to enter Lunar Eclipse, and then spend your Astral Power on Starfalls, and cast Starfire as fillers and Astral Power generators. Some more basic info I get asked about a lot. If your cooldowns are up, you are in both Lunar and Solar Eclipse simultaneously, which means your Astral spells gain bonus damage from both eclipses, so both the nature damage increase and the arcane damage increase. Our spells all work dynamically, so our dots and our Starfall's damage gets calculated as the damage happens to the target. It does not snapshot our stats when you use the ability. So each tick will do different damage depending on your character's stats and buffs in that moment. No need to refresh dots with certain buffs, and you don't have to worry about overwriting certain spells. Also, there's no such thing as haste breakpoints or any other stat amounts or percentages you should aim for. You need to sim your character and adjust your gear and gems or enchants accordingly. It can vary from character to character as well, so just because other Moonkins are doing a certain thing or are using certain sockets or certain enchants doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best for every character. This also counts for embellishments and for talents, by the way, so whenever you're looking at what other people are doing, just keep that in mind. Then, each Starfall you press has an individual timer of 8 seconds, if not otherwise reduced through talents. So even though you can have multiple Starfalls up at once and your buff will show a stack number, they do have their own individual timer depending on when you used it. So there's no such thing as refreshing your starfall or stacking up your starfall. So to explain this further, if you assume that your character's stats do not change and the amount of enemies don't change, then there's no benefit of having multiple starfalls up at the same time compared to having them up one after another. All right, now let's get into more details. First, I will show you some basic talent trees for both Raiding and Mythic Plus, including both hero talent trees as well. Keep in mind that talents are very situational and you should always adjust them depending on individual needs. I will link the talents in the description below. Make sure you just copy paste them if you want to use those exact talent builds. For the opener, I'm going to go into the opener for the single target raiding talents with Keeper of the Grove. So the way you want to do this is you want to precast 2 rafts before entering combat, and you can do this at approximately 2 seconds depending on how much haste you have if you stand pretty far away. So one quick note, before you do your opener on a raid boss, make sure you remove the dream state buffs if you have any. Because if you have the Nature's Grace buffs, then your casts are going to be quicker, and then you cannot precast at 2 seconds, which means you're going to be pre-pulling the boss. So maybe even make a Weakaura or import a Weakaura that will alert you to remove that buff, because we all know how mad the raid leader will get if you keep pre-pulling the boss. So remove the dream state buff to assure that you can precast 2 rafts on around 2 seconds. And then when you enter combat, you will regain 2 of the buffs, which you then will carry over into your cooldowns. Now, the way our Dream Burst works is that it will trigger on spell impact on the target. So let me explain this. If you use Keeper of the Grove and you use Force of Nature, you get 3 stacks of Dream Burst. This Dream Burst will be used up or detonates once your spell, like your Wrath or your Starfire, hits the target. So because our Wrath has a travel time, it is possible that you would proc the Dream Burst with a Wrath that you casted before you use your trees. So if I am on max range and I cast a Wrath and then I use Force of Nature, then I will get a Dream Burst buff, and then that Wrath that I casted before will hit the boss afterwards and will consume the Dream Burst. And we don't want this to happen during our opener. So basically what you want to do, depending on how far or how close you are to the boss, if you stand really far away, you might want to cast your Force of Nature a bit later, and if you stand really close, then you want to cast your Force of Nature earlier. So the opener, if you stand close, would be casting 2 rafts before you enter combat. Then cast Sunfire. Do not cast Moonfire. You cast Force of Nature, because Force of Nature will apply Moonfire. And then you cast Orbital Strike entering cooldowns. But if you stand really far away, then you probably have to cast Moonfire as a filler before you cast Force of Nature to delay the Dream Burst buff from being consumed from your Wrath. After you casted Orbital Strike, you want to make sure you dump some of your Astral Power into Star Surges, so you're at least below 40 Astral Power, and then you use Convoke. And that's your opener. The single target rotation continuing after this is pretty basic. You just want to make sure you keep your dots up. You enter Solar Eclipse and cast Wrath in Solar Eclipse. You stack up your Starlord as fast as possible, of course by casting Star Surges on single target. And of course, again, you want to spend your Astral Power on Star Surges, make sure you're not overcapping. And you want to make sure you use Force of Nature on cooldown, or you hold your Force of Nature for a maximum of 15 seconds to line up with Orbital Strike or your cooldowns. And you want to make sure you use Convoke inside Celestial Alignment once you're below 40 Astral Power. So if you run this talent build that I suggested, then you will have a 2-minute cooldown on your Celestial Alignment because you run Orbital Strike, and you will have a 2-minute cooldown on Convoke. So those 2 you will always line up. Your Force of Nature will have a 45-second cooldown, so you will use it at the start with your cooldowns, then you will use it twice without cooldowns, and then you will hold your Celestial Alignment or your Orbital Strike and your Convoke for your 4th set of Force of Nature to come up again, and then you can use them both at the same time. But keep in mind, of course, this all depends on fight length and what kind of boss fight you're doing, which things you have to hold your damage for, so always keep that in mind and decide how to use your cooldowns accordingly. Then, if you have a Loon's Chosen and Lunar Calling, you always enter Lunar Eclipse and cast Starfire in all situations. You also cast Starfire within Celestial Alignment or cooldowns. Then, on AoE, this is no matter if you run Keeper or Loon's Chosen, so if there's 2 or more targets, you keep up your dots, you apply Moonfires first if the targets are spread, to make sure that you're not wasting any globals on applying Sunfire multiple times. And then you enter Lunar Eclipse and you cast Starfires. And of course, you spend your astral power on Starfalls. Now let's get into consumables. You do want to run Algari Mana Oil, and you want to use Flask of Alchemical Chaos or Flask of Tempered Mastery. Then you want to use Tempered Potions, and you want to use Feast of the Midnight Masquerade or the Sushi Special. For the rest of the gear, you do want to make sure you're using an Elusive Blasphemite, which is the movement speed gem, or Culminating Blasphemite. I personally think that the movement speed is actually really good, and it does translate into extra damage because you're moving quicker, so you get to stand still faster and cast your spells again quicker. Then the weapon chant, you want to go for Authority of the Depths for a single target or Stormrider's Fury for everything else. For the chest enchant, Crystalline Radiance, Cloak, Chant of Winged Grace, Legs, Sunset Spell Threat, Wrist, Chant of Armored Avoidance, Boots, Scout's March, or Defender's March, depending if you want the movement speed or the extra health. And for the rings, you do want to make sure you're simming your character. If you don't want to bother simming, like going for Mastery is probably a good idea, but just make sure you're simming your character because your stats could be very different, and another stat might be better for you compared to that Mastery enchant. Then when it comes to embellishments, it's a little bit more complicated. For raiding, the best combination of embellishments would be Darkmoon Sigil Ascension in combination with Writhing Armor Banding. Of course, the Darkmoon Sigil Ascension is an embellishment that only goes on weapons, so either a main hand, offhand, or a two-hand weapon. Initially, I would suggest to use 2 sparks to craft Darkmoon Sigil Ascension on a two-hand weapon, which allows you to get a really high item level boost on your weapon. And then you can use the second embellishment on a lower budget piece on a 590 item level item, basically not using a spark. So use your 2 sparks on the weapon, and then if you don't have a third spark, then you can use your embellishment on a non-spark item, which goes to 590 by using Enchanted Weathered Harbinger crests. But because it's a lower item level, make sure you craft it on either a cloak or a belt or wrists. So there's just any like lower budget stat slot. Then you can also use Dusk Thread Lining as an embellishment. That one is very similar to how Silken Lining worked in Dragonflight. So if you're above a certain health percentage, then you get the stats, which can be pretty decent for M+. For raiding, especially progression raiding, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because you're going to be below that threshold quite a lot. And then you can also use Elemental Focusing Lens, which is a pretty solid embellishment for any kind of situation. This would be something that you can consider for M+. The reason why I'm suggesting these other embellishments is because Darkmoon Sigil Ascension, the weapon enchant, is going to lose quite a bit of value in Mythic+, mainly because if you drop combat, then it doesn't work as well as if you're constantly in combat, like when you're raiding, because it doesn't stack up as much anymore. So it's definitely worse in Mythic+, but it's always depending on your situation. If you do really high keys and you have long trash pulls, long boss fights, your tank keeps chaining, something like that, then of course it can still be a good embellishment for M+ as well. Then for your stats, Intellect is your best stat, Mastery and Haste are your second best stats, but always in your character, it is very possible that another stat is better for your character in particular, especially at the very start when you're crafting a lot of gear with missives. If you have your whole character only has Mastery and Haste and no crit, no verse, then those 2 stats might be really good for your character in particular. So definitely make sure you're simming your character and adjust your stats accordingly. Then when it comes to trinkets, there's quite a few trinkets that are good. Always make sure you're simming your character because the item level of the trinket, of course, matters a lot. But the trinkets that we're aiming for is Spy Master's Web. That trinket is going to be very strong. And then we also want Arakara's Sack Brute trinket as well. Some other trinkets you can go for is Gale of Shadows, Empowering Crystal of Anubekash, Ovinak's Mercurial Egg, Satchel of Misbegotten Minions, and so on and so on and so on. All right, now I want to go over some quick macros that I will also be linking in the description below. So there's an Orbital Strike macro that allows you to basically just use the ability and it goes where your mouse cursor is. So it's an at cursor macro. Then there's also an at cursor macro for Force of Nature. So you don't have to press the ability twice to get the green targeting circle. Then there's a cancelaura macro for Starlord. Starlord, you don't have to cancel it. It's not going to be a super insane damage increase. It's just if you know exactly how to cancel it, and let's say you only have a second or less left on your Starlord, and you're about to dump your astral power into Star Surges because you just entered Eclipse or used your cooldowns, then canceling it would be beneficial to make sure you're stacking up your Starlord quicker, but only use this if you actually are sure what you're doing with your canceling. Otherwise, you're going to be just losing out on damage rather than gaining damage. Then there's a macro that I have for Convoke the Spirits, which cancels your spell queue and also stops other macros from happening while you're channeling Convoke. So it basically just stops you from interrupting your own Convoke if that's something that happens to you a lot. And then there's also a Weakaura that I will link below that is from Jundarer. It's a Starfire alerter. And what this Weakaura does is that it will let you know when you should be pre-casting Starfire. So let's say you're inside Solar Eclipse and it's about to run out. Then it calculates your current haste levels and it will let you know when you can start casting Starfire. So your Starfire hits the target when you leave Eclipse. And this is useful because then you can carry over Dream State stacks into your next cooldowns and get that extra haste there, which can be beneficial. All right, that's it for the Moonkin guide. I do hope this helped you out. If you have any questions, make sure you ask in the comments below. Again, check out the Dream Growth Compendium, the Balanced Druid Compendium that I'm linking below. If you want to see some Moonkin gameplay and you want to ask more direct questions, then come over to my stream at twitch.tv/Naguura. I will be happy to help you out if you have any issues. And yeah, remember to follow my channel, subscribe if you liked the video. If you want more videos like this, make sure you give it a thumbs up as well. And thank you so much for watching. Have a nice rest of your day, and I see you on the next one. Bye.